Welcome to Test Those Breasts, a podcast by Jamie Vaughn. In this inaugural episode, my friend and guest, John Chao, interviewed me about why testing those breasts is so crucial for the early detection of breast cancer. John Chao is a radical encourager and change maker. He focuses on coaching men to remove the barriers that prevent them from being their full masculine self. As a coach with The Path, he leads men in groups to restore their wholeness with self. John is also fascinated by cross-cultural and intergenerational dynamics and is a personality assessments junkie. With a decade spent in the luxury world providing world-class service and experiences, John is now focusing on helping men level up in their 5 pillars of masculinity: body, mind, mission, relationships, and adventure. Knowing the impact of the ripple effect, he mainly spends his time producing and elevating leaders because a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, good morning, John. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I really, really appreciate it. I just want to let the audience know that one of the reasons I chose you to interview me is because we've known each other for about 2.5 years. We met in a coaching group 2.5 years ago, and you interviewed me on my first podcast, Be That Teacher. And I just really like the way you're able to pull information or the story out of people. You're really great with personalities and who people are. So I just appreciate your being here on this inaugural episode of Test Those Breasts. So welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. And sometimes when you work with people, you just know that the right fit is there. It's easy to communicate. It's easy to plan and work together. And working together on your last podcast was so much fun that working together on this one was a no-brainer.
Great. Thank you. So let's get at it. Let's talk about our first episode and all of the good stuff.
Yes. Of course, everybody is dying to find out your discovery story, because that's the big thing that a lot of people go through, is that discovery of the moment of when you found out. And so I think in your inaugural episode, it'd be great to start with that. And then we're going to get into so many other more things.
Great.
How did you first discover that you had breast cancer?
Well, it was really bizarre. I actually, in hindsight, felt a lump. And I actually had some zingers, some hotspot zingers all through last spring of 2022. Didn't really think much of it. I was finishing up my last year of teaching. I was sliding into home base of retirement and just had a lot of things going on. I was very, very busy as usual. I always am in my life. So I would kind of feel those things and kind of go, something's going on. I tend to listen to my body all the time. If anything is ever wrong, I think about it. I am the type of person to go to the doctor or call the doctor or something. And on June 4th, I had an enormous retirement party, and it was absolutely fantastic. I was on cloud 9. I was so excited to join my husband in retirement. And 2 days prior to that, my husband and I were sitting out on the front porch having a beer, and I got a little ping on my phone saying, hey, it's time for you to get a mammogram, your annual mammogram. And I go every year. I think I had to delay it once because of COVID, but I go every single year like clockwork, because in the past 8 years, I have had a lumpectomy. I've had 2 lumpectomies that turned out to be benign, but scary nevertheless. And I found out during that time that I had what was called dense breasts, and which makes it more difficult to find cancer. And so I just make sure that I go. I'm just a firm believer that we need to make sure that we're testing early and we are testing often. So about 3 days after I know. Okay. So they ask you all the time when you are making that appointment, have you felt any lumps? Have you felt any, any kind of side effects or whatever that might be different. And I said, no, because I figured that in 3 weeks I was going in to get a mammogram. I thought, hey, they'll find it if something's there. So I said, no. And I hung up the phone, and my husband looked at me and he said, that's not true. And I said, you're right. That's not true. So I picked the phone back up and said, that's not true. My husband reminded me that I do have actually a lump. If I ever feel something, I take my husband's hand and I ask him to, do you feel a lump there? And he did. And now that I think about it, it felt different than the other lumps, because when you have dense breast tissue, you have lumpy boobs. And so I was always feeling lumps, but this was different. So they moved my mammogram up by about 3 weeks, because if you have a lump, they will move it and insurance will pay for it if you have insurance. And I am very well aware that there are women out there who do not have insurance, and which is a tragedy. So I am so sorry to people who have difficulty in getting those, but they will move it up earlier. So I went in that Tuesday right after my retirement party and had the diagnostics. I always demand diagnostics where they do the ultrasound and everything. And after that, I was called into the radiologist's office, which is not something that happens if it's just a routine check, if something's not wrong. So I knew right away that something was up. And I walked in, and Dr. McDonald, cute little radiologist, had these big screens up of my breasts. And he was showing me these calcifications. He says the calcifications are normal, but it's the groupings of calcifications when they get concerned. And then there was an associated mass. And so right then and there, the nurse took me to the telephone to make an appointment to get a biopsy. And the biopsy was set for about a week and a half out. We have a really, really good friend of ours who is a radiologist at the breast center here. And he just happened to be at my retirement party a few days prior. So I asked them to share the results with him, which was good because he was able to look at them very quickly. And that night on June 7th, I was on my way I was actually standing in line to see a concert. And he called me at 6:00. He had the chance to look at it. And he told me that it was about a 95% chance or more that it was breast cancer. So I knew that I was in trouble at that point. Mm-hmm. And then he was able to move my biopsy up to that Friday.
Oh, great.
Went and did the biopsy, which was absolutely horrendously painful. And then the very next day we were camping, and he said, do you want me to call you in 24 hours when I know, or do you want me to call you on Monday? And I said, I want you to call me once you know. So he called me literally 24 hours later at 3:30 in the afternoon and let me know that it was breast cancer. And I was sitting around with my husband and two of our friends that we camp with all the time. And so I had support sitting right there. We had just gotten finished from paddle boarding and things like that. So,
wow.
Yeah.
The word that comes to mind listening to that entire story is vigilance. And it's so wonderful that you've had the vigilance of doing the tests every year. It's so wonderful that you've had the vigilance of sharing with your husband what's going on when you feel something, the vigilance of calling back and saying, no, I do feel lumps, the vigilance of keeping up to date with all these things. I think sometimes for whatever reason, we let ourselves, our own health slide, and we're like, oh, we'll get to that later. But your vigilance is literally why you're able to be here today. And I'm so glad that you went through all of that with so much vigilance. And it's something that people who are listening right now can definitely keep in mind and perhaps sharpen in their own life because they're learning from you.
Right. And I can't tell you how many women I know put things off. And, because we're so busy, and I am so busy that, I can get to it later. But I actually do listen to my body, and I try to encourage other women to listen to their bodies and don't wait. And, just get out there and go to the doctor and figure it out, because it's
Hmm.
probably not just in your mind. Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's different. There's a difference between maybe procrastinating on your taxes and the consequences of that versus procrastinating on your body and your health and the consequences of that.
Right.
They're very, very different. You mentioned that you had support when you first found out, which I'm so glad to hear because there's nothing worse than finding something out like this and being by yourself. Can you share with us your personal reaction to this when you found out about the news and go a little bit more in depth with it?
Oh, gosh. John, I really felt like I was falling into a completely different dimension. It was a very dark place. It got darker later. I was sitting out at the lake with my friends at our campsite. So I felt protected and I felt loved, but I knew that I was in for a lot. I didn't quite know how much, but my heart sank. I wanted my mommy, and my mommy is no longer with me. She died in October of 2019, and I would have given anything to have my mom there. She was a very nurturing woman, and I just felt really lost. Like I felt like I was not connected to the real world. It was really bizarre and surreal.
I could imagine. Yeah, and there's just that kind of a news. So many things must have been going on in your head. So thank you for sharing that reaction. What about the people around you? How did they react? Because obviously immediately you had support there, but then you also eventually shared the news with
Yeah.
friends and other family. Tell us more about that.
So the first people I called were my brothers and my dad. And I called them right there from the campsite and let them know. And I think, they had to process it. I had to process it. So not a huge reaction yet from them, other than, are you okay? And asking me a lot of questions that I just didn't know yet. And so I just found out, and they were very supportive, very loving. My two friends, our friends Bob and Paula, were with us. And Paula, I'll never forget, she immediately put this little bracelet on me. It said strength on it. And she had been given that by a friend who had given her that when she was going through some really hard times. And she says, I'm here for all of it, all of it. And I knew that
Wow.
she was, because that's the kind of person she is. And so lots of support from them. And then I'm a very open person. I'm an open book. I process better if I am sharing my real life. And so I made the decision to go public on social media to let people know. So I did. And I got all kinds of lots of different comments. Mostly, they were all very supportive. I think one of the most interesting reactions that I got was, "Oh my gosh, Jamie, you were so healthy." Like this mind blow, you were so healthy. And that really confused me, because I was healthy and I am healthy. And I had just spent the last year and a half before that getting healthier. I was working out a lot. I was eating better. I had dropped some weight and I felt so much better. So I couldn't figure out why anybody would say, but you were so healthy, because come to find out, healthy people can get cancer.
Yes.
I mean, good call. It's crazy. Healthy people
Mm-hmm.
can get cancer. And so I think later I found out that people really focus on the why it happened rather than what cancer even is. And we all have
Correct.
cancer cells, and we are all prone to having that perfect storm strike us. And I
Mm-hmm.
learned that from a person that I reached out to, Eddie, in Australia, who I'm going to be interviewing later on. And I told you about him earlier. He was really helpful in helping me understand why people say things like that. It just kind of blew me away. And I think later I did a post saying, I want to let people know that I do have a healthy vessel of a body. I was
Mm,
overwhelmed with the people who came forward to help me out. I had a tribe of girlfriends who came over, brought me gifts, and helped me get a room in our house ready to heal because I found out what my treatments were going to be. Just everybody was so loving and supportive. So, and my
mhm.
family as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. I want to just reiterate that a lot of athletes get cancer as well. There recently was a Peloton instructor who has breast cancer.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I don't think that health and cancer has really much to do with each other. And this isn't a planned question, so I kind of want to just pick your brain
Okay.
on this.
Okay.
When people respond, do you have some guidance or some tips? Because I think it's very silly when somebody announces that they're going through something. Unfortunately, the people who are responding make it about themselves versus that person. And
Sure.
so, do you
Yeah.
have any tips on what not to say? What would be an appropriate thing to say? Because you've experienced it yourself. And I think some people who may, in the first time, for the first time, experience their friend maybe going through something, what would you advise them and how to respond?
John, that is such a good question. I've learned so much through this journey. And even
Mm-hmm.
I look back before I had cancer and think to myself, holy cow, did I say those things to people when they told me that they
Mm,
had cancer?
mm-hmm.
And it's okay. I mean, I don't want to criticize
Oh,
anyone at all. The advice that I have is to validate that person's feelings and what they are
mm,
going through. A lot of
mm-hmm.
people say things like, oh my gosh, Jamie, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry, but you are so strong and you can get through this. And that is a great thing to say, but I can't tell you how many buts I've heard. But this or but that.
Mm,
This, and this, but this, and this. I think I've heard the word but a million times this year. I think that people need to first realize that not everyone is religious. That's a big one. Not
yep.
everyone believes in God.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody might have their own God, but not everybody believes in like a religious type God. So God will protect you, or let's pray to God, or things like that. We
Mm,
have to be really, really careful about what we're saying to someone when we don't know what their background
correct.
is or what
Yep.
their beliefs are, if they're spiritual or not, or, things like that. And I want to put it out there that I know that people are well meaning. They just are. They want to
Yeah.
help, they want to give you comfort, and that's wonderful. And so I can take it that way, but I really try to understand who that person is and realize that they are being kind. I have learned that when I hear things about people, I say something to the effect of, oh my gosh, John, I am so sorry this is happening to you. That must feel absolutely horrendous. I'm here. How can I help? And not say things like, my mom went through that and she died,
Mm-hmm.
but you're going to make this. You're going to make
Oh no. Oh no, Jamie. Oh
yeah.
gosh.
Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, and I feel there's a lot of psychology behind it. People
Yes.
just
And I
don't know
think
what to say, they just don't.
no, and I think it's also very healthy for people to go through some sensitivity training for anything that comes up. So I'm so glad that you answered this question
Well, let
for
me tell
people
you,
from
the best training is get cancer, and then then you'll hear it
yes,
all,
right?
and then you realize.
As a quick follow up, was there any one person's reaction or response that kind of maybe was unexpected or threw you for a loop? I know that you mentioned that some family members said something maybe perhaps out of their own discomfort.
Yeah.
And so they were trying to break the tension, but it may not have been the best thing for you to hear.
Well, I won't pinpoint a family member, but I have about 3 or 4 men, and I think maybe a woman. I'm not sure if I remember correctly. When I found out that I had to have a mastectomy, that was, after my chemo finished. I had to go through chemo, and I told people I had to have a mastectomy. And one of the first reactions was, "Oh my gosh." One guy said, "How big are your titties going to be?" And I'm like, "Wait, whoa." And somebody said, "Well, at least you can have those 20-year-old boobs now." And I said, I don't want those. I love my own breasts, and I don't want to lose my own breasts.
Mm.
And
Oh
I just,
gosh.
so I gently said, "But I don't want 20-year-old boobs. I am 55 years
Mm.
old and I don't want those. And I never did. This isn't a boob job. This is not something I'm
Mm-hmm.
choosing." And so
Yep.
one person did apologize to me, and a couple people apologized to me because I gently told them, "Mm-mm, mm-mm."
And
So,
what a beautiful show of boundaries on your end and being able and willing to speak up for yourself
yeah,
instead of just letting it be water under the bridge, which I know, and you'll probably get into this in other episodes, where when we hold in our emotions, that also does things to our bodies as well.
yeah.
So I just wanted to commend you for being able to speak up in this way. I want to get into your perspective on fear versus hope, because I think that's a very big thing, especially when people are just finding out about an announcement of this kind or discovery of their situation.
Yeah. John, I was very, very fearful. I was so scared. When I found out last June 11th, I went into a whirlwind of craziness because when you find something out like that, the everything goes so fast. It was so overwhelming. You have scans and tests, blood tests, and this and that, and all these things. You're meeting your oncologist, you're meeting your surgeon, and hearing all of these things. It was a very, very, very scary time for me, and I am and was very, very lucky to have the caregiver that I have in my husband. He was with me every step of the way, every
Mm.
step of the way, even the meltdowns. I had meltdowns. I remember going in to get my PET scan one day, and that same day I was supposed to get I was getting my port installed. And I had a complete and utter meltdown in the parking lot right before the PET scan because it just smacked me up against the head. I realized that this was my life right now, that this was my life.
Mm.
My first year of retirement, this was my life.
Oh.
Scans, blood tests, surgeries, chemo, the whole everything. And so I was really scared. There was one point in time in July before I started my chemo that I was laying awake at night, really, really scared, and thinking to myself, I need to change something. I need to figure out a way to get out of this deep, dark hole, because if I continue to stay there, it's not going to come out pretty. And
Wow.
my journey, and I needed to figure out a way to change the narrative of how this was all going to go down. And so I started researching and looking on Facebook for some support groups. And I found a guy named Eddie, and he is in Australia. He is a therapist. He is a 3-time cancer survivor. And I started reading his stuff. He had some ebooks and videos and things like that. And I went ahead and reached out to him and I said, "Eddie, I just received news that I have breast cancer. I'm wondering if we can talk." And he sent me one of his ebooks and I just read it immediately. And it
Yes.
was so good that he and I actually got on Zoom a couple of times so that he could help me with things like what to eat and things like that. He's the one that told me
Wow.
that he was trying to figure out why he got cancer 3 times. It's like,
Mm.
how can I get through this cancer without, without dying. Like I needed to figure that out. And he said that people tend to think about cancer in a physical way. He says he knows that he was only focusing on the physical and he wasn't focusing on the mental. And so once he figured out that he needed to focus on the mental and emotional health, he was able to not get cancer again. So he decided to become a therapist and helping people with that holistic healing. And I thought, yes, this is me. This is totally up my alley. This is something that I want to do. And so from that point forward, yes, I was still scared, but I also knew that I had some tools that I could use to be able to move forward. I hope that makes sense.
Yes,
so I had hope. So I had hope.
Mm-hmm. What a powerful way of describing all of that, because I think sometimes people feel the pressure of needing to be at a certain place emotionally, whereas you were very authentic to yourself and you also helped yourself get out of the fear instead of staying in it. So the hope wasn't a delusional hope or just something that you were optimistic about. You brought yourself to that place and you gave yourself the space to fear, but you gave yourself the space to also become hopeful. And it's just so powerful. I could see that as something being very integral in your journey. But also, I'm very excited that Eddie's going to be on your podcast and you guys will be able to talk about all of this.
He was such a turning point for me. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast, is to help people realize that the thoughts in their head are legitimate. And we need to give that space to people to be able to walk through those emotions and realize that there is help out there. We just need to know how to find it. I'm really good at finding help. A lot of people just kind of go into their little shell and, try to deal with things on their own. And I encourage people not to do that. I know that there are people that are way more private than I am, and that's totally okay. That does not mean that you can't reach out and find the perfect people to help you get through this very scary time. And so Eddie was that first person who I'm still in touch with. I reached out to him and he knows exactly who I am. And yes, he's going to be on my podcast. And I'm so excited. He's a therapist in Australia. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's so for the people who are listening who may not be the research type like yourself, at least now they have this podcast.
Yeah.
We're going to bring on wonderful guests who are in the profession or who are doctors or who have gone through the experience themselves. And it's going to be a really, really thorough podcast for people to be able to learn all about breast cancer. So I'm really happy that you're doing this as a resource for people to be able to learn as well. We're going to end with some practical things. So I think it'd be really helpful for those who are listening to know, what kind of treatments and surgery did you experience through this whole thing?
Well, it's funny because, when you find out that somebody has cancer, you automatically think, oh, especially like with breast cancer, what I knew, oh, the person's going to have surgery and then it's just going to be out. And sometimes that does happen where they just have to have a lumpectomy. They caught it early. They don't have to go through chemo or radiation or anything like that. I personally had to go through 6 rounds of chemo. I ended up only going through 5 because I developed a very rare anemia, which is a totally different story. They found a huge tumor, thymoma tumor in my thoracic cavity in next to my heart when they discovered the breast cancer. It was big. It was really big. And so they had to stop it, but I had to go through chemo. And I asked the surgeon, why am I going through chemo first? And they said, because with my type of cancer, it was the HER2 positive, estrogen and progesterone negative. They do the chemo first to shrink the tumor. My tumor was about 5 centimeters. I was in stage 2. So they want to shrink the tumor first and then do the surgery. Whereas some breast cancers, they do the surgery first and then they do chemo and radiation, or some people need radiation, some people don't. I did not need radiation. By the time I had my surgery, in December, my mastectomy and reconstruction. They pulled some lymph nodes and there was no evidence of cancer. So I didn't have to have radiation.
Gotcha. And it's really
Yeah.
helpful because then people who are listening to this podcast can know what you've gone through and then can ask specific questions related
Yeah.
to. Now, some people may have a totally different breast cancer experience, but at least they can know what you have gone through personally.
Right.
I think this is a really good place to finish off. You mentioned earlier that people came to you and say, "Oh, you're so strong. You're going to get through this." And I wanted you to speak a little bit about how that made you feel when people would say that.
Well, I felt weak. I felt weak. And I know that, because I am so open and I share the good, the bad, the ugly with people, I actually started a private Facebook group so that people had the option if they wanted to hear my story or not. Because not everybody wants to hear your story or, whatever. So the way that I was able to get through all of this is to be able to be open and tell it all, say it, just say it. I went live. People saw me go through losing my hair. I got this badass haircut beforehand. Then it started falling out, and then we cut it. My husband shaved it. So people saw me through the whole entire process of cancer. And I didn't feel strong. And I'm going to circle back to the beginning of the podcast episode when we were talking about things that you should and should not say. We need to hold space for the people and how they're feeling. When people told me that I was strong, I know that they meant well. I know they did. And I know that they do. And maybe I am strong. I mean, I made it through this, but I also felt really weak. And when people said that to me, I felt like they weren't allowing me to feel weak. They weren't allowing me to feel all the feels. And that's not their fault. Again, people say these things to help. And I get that. Some people don't get that. Some people do feel very kind of like they're not allowed to feel weak. Here's another good one. Stay strong. Well, you know what? Sometimes you just can't stay strong all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No.
It's just a really interesting perspective that I have now.
Yes, it is.
And sometimes you don't get that perspective until you either hear it from somebody or you go through something like this.
Yes. And I literally was just going to say thank you for sharing all of this, because this wasn't just you sharing your story of how you discovered breast cancer and what you went through, but also this was very educational on how people can view the experience and how to learn how to connect with another person who may be going through it. And this was so much more than you just sharing the story. We learned a whole bunch in this episode. And I'm excited to get into the next episode where we learn more about you. But we wanted to focus on your story of this today.
Thank you very much. Well, I appreciate your being here, John. And hopefully some people will get some good nuggets out of this. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again on the next episode.